I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, with my stupendous co-host, Brett.
Hello, Alice. It's a pleasure, as always, to talk to you tonight. I have missed you so much.
I really miss you. So, this is like week 2, day 5, really, of us not working side by side at work, and it's really sad. Basically, what I do every day is I text Brett incessantly to ask how he's doing and then to ask if he wants to record at night. So, I've just become more annoying of a co-host.
And I just ignore her because I'm bitter. Bitter and angry that she left me, but it's okay. I'm not holding a grudge.
No. We just share one job together instead of 2 now.
I've had several people who are prosecutors reach out, say that they're willing to replace you if I need another prosecutor. And I'm like,
it hurts, but it's deserved.
We're going to hold on to Alice. So,
well, kind of along those lines of, being angry, Brett. Today, we have a very interesting topic, and that's the law of self-defense and when you can use it, when it's justified, and is there ever a time when it crosses the line to being where you're the offender instead of the self-defender? So this is all very interesting, and it comes up a lot in defenses, but in reality, it's actually employed less than I think you'd actually think in real cases.
Yeah, it's interesting. Number one, I would say there's a lot of misinformation and misunderstanding about this topic. We talked about it all the way back at the beginning of our other podcast, The Prosecutors. The Billy Woodward case had an element of self-defense in it. And what we're going to talk about today, is a little bit more straightforward. I will say this. Usually, if you make it to trial, you have a problem with your self-defense argument because prosecutors and police departments are very solicitous to true self-defense claims. Obviously, we're all in the business of stopping the bad guys from hurting innocent people. And when we see a case where someone else is put in a position where they have to do that, if it's legitimate, we are eager to go ahead and not prosecute that case. So if the case is going to trial, it means you've got some police and prosecutors who typically would not be a fan of whoever it was who was shot because they're probably a criminal in some way, who have decided that nevertheless the action taken by the person who's being tried wasn't self-defense, that it was criminal in some sort of way. And obviously that doesn't mean that everyone who goes to trial and claims self-defense is lying or needs to be convicted. But I think one of the reasons, as Alice said, it doesn't tend to play as much of a role in your average trial as you might expect is just because a lot of those are weeded out at a much earlier time. If you have a legitimate self-defense claim and it's rock solid, nobody wants to put you through the time, hassle, stress of a trial, especially wasting everyone's time, wasting the jury's time. And as we've said many times, we have a duty as prosecutors not to prosecute people who we think we can't convict or shouldn't be convicted or who the evidence doesn't prove beyond a reasonable doubt they were guilty. And obviously, something like self-defense comes in to that calculus.
Absolutely. And of course, as always, we have a great case to discuss with you to illustrate what we're talking about, this legal principle that we're talking about, because it's always so much easier to put facts to these doctrines to better flesh out what these doctrines mean.
And this is a case that was recently in the news, and it actually all happened back in July. So on July 31st, 2022, James Rayl showed up at his ex-girlfriend's house in Sydney, Ohio. Inside were his ex, Allison Duckrow, and her parents, Stacy Duckrow and Mitchell Duckrow. James and Allison had broken up in 2019, so this was 3 years after their relationship had ended. Before their breakup, James had been emotionally abusive to Allison, and these are things that are not going to surprise anybody, and unfortunately, probably a lot of you out there have heard things like this. He would tell her things like she was worthless. He had a tendency to catalog all her faults. And whenever she would talk about breaking up, he would tell her that without him, she'd be alone forever because no one was going to love her anymore. These are all typical sort of coercive control things. These are the ways that abusive people, even if they're not physically abusive, maintain their control over others. And he was doing that. Fortunately for Allison, she was able to end this relationship in 2019, and she was pretty happy when James left the area. He actually moved to California. And, she blocked him on her social media. She went on with her life. And I think her expectation was her involvement with James was over forever. And she was very happy about that.
But then he came back to Ohio, and on July 30th, 2022, he left a voicemail on her phone. He said, "Hi, Allie, it's James. I just wanted to reach out to you because I just wanted to see how you're doing and maybe hear from you. If that would be all right, I guess. It's been a while since I've talked to you, and I don't know. I feel like I don't know what I feel." Now, this voicemail really had Allison scared. She'd heard that James had changed in the 3 years since they seen each other. And remember, they haven't had any contact in these 3 years. And she was worried what this voicemail might mean. Then he showed up at her family's door.
And I think it's really interesting because when you read this voicemail, it doesn't seem like anything that jumps out to you as overtly threatening. But I think Allison, number one, she knows James, and she's in tune to the kind of relationship they had. And so to her, this voicemail was very chilling. And I bet there's a lot of you out there who've been in relationships like this and have gotten out of them, who know this is a tactic, right? So people who are abusive and controlling, they tend to be that way when you're in the relationship. If you manage to get away, or if they think they're going to lose you, one of the strategies is to feign a change of heart, a new perspective. This is a very sort of innocuous thing. This is his way to get back in the door. And she is very smart to recognize the threat that this is. This looks like honey, but it's poison. And she recognizes that, and she realizes, I don't want anything to do with this. So she doesn't call him back. And she's thinking, I don't want anything to do with this guy. This was a disaster the first time around. Hopefully he'll just leave me alone. But as Alice said, that was on July 30th. On July 31st, all of a sudden, he is there at the house. So James, he comes to the doorbell. The family had a Ring camera on his doorbell, so all of this is recorded. But James, he comes to the front door. He rings the doorbell. The family, they know that he's out there. It's Allison and her parents. She has no interest in talking to him. And so her mother and her father sort of tell him through the door that she doesn't want to talk to him and he should leave. And at this point, James actually, he walks away from the door. And if you can sort of imagine, I'll set this up for you. There's a porch. He's standing on the porch. There's a glass door, a sort of outside door that he's got open. Then there's a garage running to his left, and there's a carport in front of it. So he leaves, he walks down the steps, down the sidewalk with the carport now on his right side, and turns to go around that carport. And you might think, and they certainly thought, okay, he's leaving. But a few minutes later, he actually comes back. And if you've seen the video, and we'll put a link to a New York Post article that has the video pretty much in its entirety. There are several videos. Some of them are shorter than others, and you can find various videos. Some of them cut out some of the things that we're going to talk about, but usually the video starts when he comes back. So most of the videos you're going to see when he's ringing the doorbell, this is actually the second time that he's been on the porch. So you see him walk up. He looks incredibly calm, as calm as he could be. It's much like the phone call. He's not raging.
Almost emotionless. It's not just calm. Calm kind of indicates that someone's in control of their emotions. It's almost like he's completely detached from any emotion at all. His face is completely stoic.
That's a really good point. I'm glad you said that because it's hard to describe. Cold, emotionless, almost robotic. Stoic is another word to describe it. If you see this video, there is something about him that will immediately send a chill down your spine. And it's so interesting because it's not the raging, crazy-eyed, yelling, screaming, cussing thing that you might think of when somebody's angry. It's something that you can understand, and you sort of can meet that where it is. It's a very sort of open and honest emotion, right? This is much more chilling. And when you see it, and I hope you all will watch this video, when you see it, there is something really dark about it. And I think you'll see that. And what's crazy about it is as we walk through this video, at no point does it change. This demeanor never changes, not until the very end.
Yeah, especially, and that's a really great point that you say there, Brett, because his demeanor when he shows up, the detached stoicism, is unchanged, which is in stark contrast to the rising level of panic and anxiety that Allie and her parents are exhibiting, because you can hear what they're saying, and they're clearly escalating in how scared they're getting, and they're verbalizing their fear, as you'll see as we walk through this video. And he does not match that. And that is very interesting because obviously we're all relational beings and we can't help but typically take on the emotions of those around us. But he has none of that here. He doesn't get more agitated. He doesn't get heightened. He doesn't get more rushed. It's as if he's completely detached from the situation and is going to plow forward no matter what.
So up to this point, the family had hoped he was going to leave. But now that they see him come back, Allison can be heard saying that she's going to call 911. Everybody's inside, but you can hear some of this going on because the video is being recorded and the sound is being recorded on this camera. So her mother is talking through the door to this guy, and she says, James, she doesn't want to talk to you. There is no response from James. James can be seen opening the glass door. Then there's this moment where, if you find the right video where you see the whole thing, he kind of squints his eyes for a second. And once again, it's a chilling moment because it feels like him making a decision. When he does that, he makes a decision. He immediately starts to jiggle the door handle several times as if he's trying to open the door but finding it locked. He pushes the door with his hand, trying to open the door. At this point, you hear Allison's father, Mitchell, and he tells him to get off his porch. Once again, there is no reaction from him. At this point, he's still jiggling the door. He's sort of trying to get in. Stacy and Mitchell, who are Allison's mom and dad, you can hear them yelling out that he needs to go. He needs to go. He just needs to get off the porch. He just needs to leave. He pays them no attention. There's no way he didn't hear them. He absolutely heard them, but he is ignoring them. Mitchell once again yells out, "Get off my porch." And it's at this point where James becomes absolutely committed and he starts to ram his shoulder into the door, attempting to break it down.
By this time, Allison has called 911. On the call, as James is ramming into the door, she can be heard asking her dad if James is trying to kill her. He rams his shoulder into the door 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and the glass shatters and the door begins to break. Allison runs to hide, and Mitchell yells out, "I've got a gun." So he's doing everything he can to deter James, telling him he's armed, telling him repeatedly in no uncertain terms, "Get off my property." But instead of being deterred, James rears up and brings his shoulder into the door with the most force yet. Now at this point, Mitchell fires. He fires 3 shots. The first shot hits James. He turns to the side and is hit again by the second shot. Now his back is to Mitchell and he's hit again from the back. He stumbles into the driveway, lays down, and dies. So these 3 shots happen in a matter of maybe 2 seconds. So essentially, Mitchell has the gun out, says, "I've got a gun." James rams into the door with the most force yet. Mitchell fires, hits in the front. James starts to turn, hits him in the side, turns around, hits him in the back. But this is all pow, pow, pow. That's how fast it is. Throughout the entire incident, James never says a word or makes a sound. On the 911 call, Allison can be heard saying, "Dad, there's nothing you could have done. You saved my life." Now, this was brought to a grand jury, and they were impaneled to review this case. Ultimately, that grand jury voted not to indict Mitchell with a vote of 8-1. The question is, did they get it right not to indict Mitchell?
And just as an aside, this is an example of the way grand juries are sometimes used. I think it's probably the case here that the prosecution wanted to go ahead and have a grand jury hear this so the grand jury could decide not to indict. People criticize grand juries all the time, a lot of times because they don't understand them. And they don't understand sort of the role they play, particularly in communities and states. And I mean, one thing, federal grand juries, I don't know, maybe you can criticize them, but state grand juries, people always talk about how grand juries can indict a ham sandwich. State grand juries, local grand juries, often don't indict cases. They have a lot of what's called a no bill. And a lot of times, prosecutors are fine with that. They want to sort of give the case its chance before the community's arbiter, in this case, the grand jury. And if the grand jury wants to go forward, then they'll go forward and they'll try the case. But in a case like this, you have an 8-1 vote. That's very powerful. Grand jury, remember, in order for a grand jury to indict, they only have to find probable cause that a crime was committed. It was more likely than not that a crime was committed. It's not beyond a reasonable doubt. And so this is a big message of, we've looked at this, there's no case here, we're not going to indict. So it's not necessarily that the prosecution was all gung-ho to prosecute this guy. In fact, it probably was either somewhere in the middle or they really did not want to, but rather than just declining to prosecute, so that everyone feels like there was some process here, including James's family, who, you know, they think he needs justice and he's an innocent guy. They're actually the ones who released that message that he sent to Allison because they thought it sounded okay. They thought it made him sound better because it's so innocuous. But if you really know what's going on there, you realize how not innocuous it is. But in any event, they sort of had their day in court as well. The grand jury heard the case. They decided not to indict. So did they get it right? Well, let's talk about Ohio law. Now, Ohio has what is called a stand your ground law. You know, what exactly does that mean? First of all, stand your ground laws are kind of controversial in the abstract because of some high profile cases. Trayvon Martin case is probably the most famous with George Zimmerman. George Zimmerman shot Trayvon Martin, claimed that he felt threatened under Florida's stand your ground law and was acquitted. So that made them a little controversial. But in reality, they're not that controversial. Most people, even if they don't realize it, actually kind of support it. But let's talk about what it means. It all begins with something called the Castle Doctrine, which is about as old as you can get. I mean, it's called the Castle Doctrine, so that should tell you something. And it's sort of the notion that your home is your castle. And the Castle Doctrine says if you are in your home, you have no duty to retreat. So what is a duty to retreat? In traditional self-defense law, a person is required to at least attempt to avoid a confrontation if they can reasonably do so. So you have to imagine how this goes. You have someone who's threatening you, who's violent, who's a threat to your life. You feel threatened by them. You have a reasonable fear for your life. Well, under a traditional self-defense law, that wasn't enough. You still had to try and retreat. You had to try and bring the situation down to some lower level of confrontation. And you can see why that's not that popular. It sort of puts you, the innocent person, at a great disadvantage because you have to essentially try and run away and hope you can get away. And if you can't get away, then you can use force. But it gives your attacker an advantage. Well, because of that, it ordinarily doesn't apply in your own home. If you're in your own home, the rule has always been you don't have to try and retreat. If somebody comes into your house and they don't have a legal right to be there, you can use deadly force against them. Generally speaking, to invoke the Castle Doctrine, you must prove the following. So here are some of the things you have to show to invoke the Castle Doctrine. The first thing, an intruder must be making or have made an attempt to enter an occupied residence unlawfully or forcibly. So you're in your home and somebody is trying to come into your house forcibly without your permission. So that's an important thing. If you let them in, then, the castle doctrine all of a sudden doesn't work. What we don't want you to be able to do is invite someone in, shoot them, and then be like, oh, castle doctrine. And this is actually sort of a traditional problem with the castle doctrine. It has been used to commit murder before in some instances, so we want to avoid that. In this case, the intruder must be acting unlawfully. They must be doing something to you that's a violation of the law. You must reasonably believe that they intend to inflict some sort of serious bodily harm on you or on somebody else in the home.
And this is all, again, in the abstract, it's hard to know, but it typically has to be very clear. So like in this instance, the people never opened the door at all. They're talking to him through the door. You can see this all captured on the Ring camera. He clearly states, leave, you're not welcome here, go away. So far, it's been very clear cut in the fact pattern we've laid out that the intruder is unwelcome. There's no sort of gray area where he may be mistaken and think that he's actually being invited in.
And the last thing on this is you can't have provoked this person into entering your home. And what they're trying to avoid with this is, once again, drawing someone into your home so that you can kill them. We are trying to avoid that. And so pretty much all of these limitations are on that. So really what we're looking for here, someone who's just enjoying their home, they're in their house, they're not doing anything, and all of a sudden somebody shows up and they're trying to get into the house and they're threatening them, and you don't have to run out the back door. You can defend your home. A couple things, you have to be a lawful person, and not just that you're in the house legally, but you can't be a fugitive. You can't be involved in some sort of crime. If you are involved in a crime, in a criminal activity, you can't claim this. So, for instance, if you're running, say, a drug operation out of your home and somebody breaks in to rob you and you kill them, the castle doctrine is not going to apply for you. You may be able to argue self-defense at some point in trial, but the castle doctrine, which is a much sort of stronger shield, even against prosecution, isn't going to be as helpful for you because of what you were doing. And the other thing, this doesn't apply to police officers. So if you're, barricaded in your home and the police show up for some reason, you can't shoot the police because they're trying to get into your house. So we're not going to let you use this in ridiculous circumstances. So these may seem like a lot of rules, but actually this is not that complicated. If you're legally in your home, not doing anything, and somebody shows up and tries to get in and tries to hurt you, you can use deadly force against that person.
And this all makes a lot of sense, right? We all think of our home as somewhere that's safe and somewhere we should be able to enjoy our freedoms behind our closed doors. And if someone is intruding upon that, that seems to kind of offend our deepest core of what it means to, have liberties and ability to enjoy our freedoms. So what do stand your ground laws do in reality? Well, they say that you have no duty to retreat no matter where you are, home or not. Anywhere you are legally allowed to be, you can invoke the same right to self-defense as if you were in your home without having to retreat first. But every single state has the castle doctrine. Now, this is really a castle doctrine case, and Ohio's law reads as follows. A person is allowed to act in self-defense, defense of another, or defense of that person's residence if at the trial of a person who is accused of an offense that involved the person's use of force against another, there is evidence presented that tends to support that the accused person used the force in self-defense, defense of another, or defense of that person's residence. The prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused person did not use the force in self-defense, defense of another, or defense of that person's residence, as the case may be. And also, a person is presumed to have acted in self-defense or defense of another when using defensive force that is intended or likely to cause death or great bodily harm to another if the person against whom the defensive force is used is in the process of unlawfully and without privilege to do so entering, or has unlawfully and without privilege to do so entered the residence or vehicle occupied by the person using the defensive force. So that's the legal definition in Ohio law.
And I just want to point out how powerful this defense is for you. So you use deadly force. If you can invoke the castle doctrine, you got a couple of things going for you. The first thing is you are presumed to have acted in self-defense. So if someone's trying to get into your home and you kill them, you have a presumption that you acted in self-defense. So you're not even starting on an even playing field with the prosecution or whoever's accusing you. There's a presumption, and the prosecution has to overcome that presumption. And they not only have to overcome it, but they have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So to the absolute highest level, they have to show that when you used force in defense of your home, you were not acting in self-defense, that you didn't have a reasonable fear for your own life or the life of another. And that's really hard to do. It's going to be very difficult to meet that burden. And you can see why, given that definition we just read to you, this is an absolutely straightforward case. There can be little doubt that James was attempting to break into the home of another. If you watch the video, it's 100% there. He's not allowed to be in there. The people inside the house tell him he's not allowed to be in there. So they're not inviting him in. They're not taunting him. They're telling him, our daughter doesn't want to talk to you. You need to leave. You need to go. Get off my porch. It's very clear you can't be here. Despite that, he begins to ram his shoulder into this door. He's shattering glass. Wood is starting to splinter. He's putting his shoulder into this door over and over and over again. And because of that, there can be little doubt that Mitchell shot him in defense of both his home and his family. Remember, the castle doctrine says they're trying to get into your home. That's enough. If you feel like they're breaking into your house, that's enough. Mitchell has two things. He not only thinks this guy's trying to break into his house, he knows why. He's coming after his daughter. His daughter's obviously in fear for her life. She's hiding, she's crying, she's screaming, she's asking her dad if he's going to kill her. So Mitchell, in his state of mind, he's thinking, this guy is going to try and kill my family. And what's interesting about this, we talked about the duty to retreat and how you don't have one. Mitchell kind of exercises retreat. And what I mean by that is he tells James, I have a gun. Now, that's not retreating, but it's giving information to the attacker in the hopes that they will break off their attack. Mitchell really was well within his rights to shoot James, probably the first time he put his shoulder into that door. Questionable if when he's jiggling the handle and he's trying to get in, if he'd have shot him then, maybe it's a closer question. First time he puts his shoulder into that door, Mitchell doesn't have to warn him. He can pull out his gun and shoot him right then. He can shoot him right in the face. And he would be perfectly justified in doing so, but he doesn't do that. 4 times James puts his shoulder into that door before Mitchell shoots him. Before the last time, Mitchell tells him, I have a gun. And after receiving that information, not only does James not stop, but he hits the door the hardest he'd hit it the whole time, with the most force. And it was at that point that Mitchell shot him. And it was perfectly reasonable at that point for Mitchell to have a legitimate fear of James. I don't know how you wouldn't have been afraid of James.
Especially when, I think you can hear it from the outside, but this is all backed up by kind of an independent action. They're calling 911, right? That is a real action that engages law enforcement from the outside. And clearly, Allison is calling 911 to call for help to come here. And you are allowed to act when law enforcement is not there to help you in time. And that's exactly what's happening. She's on the phone with 911. 911 can overhear what's going on. And there's clearly not enough time for law enforcement to react to this 911 call, to send someone to the scene to help them because the door is already starting to shatter. I mean, it's almost like textbook if you read the Ohio statute definition of castle doctrine alongside the video that's happening. It is textbook what you would learn in a law school classroom of how to properly apply the castle doctrine.
And the only question here, and the only place there's really been any controversy, and the thing that some of James' family members have focused on, is the third shot, which does hit James in the back as he was arguably turning to run away. But this is basically completely irrelevant. The law presumes that people are not robots. You're in a life or death situation, someone's attacking you. Number one, if you have the right to use deadly force, you have the right to kill someone. If you're going to pull that trigger once, you can pull it as many times as you want. The law's not going to split hairs on this. This all happened in 2 seconds at the most. That third shot, when he's pulling the trigger on that third shot, James may be turning. He didn't have to wait to see whether James is going to turn and run away. He is allowed to kill James at that point. And for all he knows, nothing else has stopped James. Maybe he's just going to keep coming. Maybe he's turning to pull out a gun. He doesn't know, and he doesn't have to wait to see. He is allowed to continue to act.
And remember, James even turned away and walked away before the ramming incident. So just because he's turning away, from past experience of this particular interaction, they had no reason to believe James was going to leave. But I think if you see the sequence of shots and how quickly it is not a situation where he's taking off running and his back is to them and he's like gaining distance between them, and then you hear shots ringing out to hit his back. Really, it hits his back almost by accident because of the way James is turning his body in reaction to being hit.
And the other thing is the law doesn't turn on technicalities. And I'll just go ahead and tell you, anytime you hear people try and say, if X happens, then Y happens in the law, or in order to commit a crime, you have to do exactly this, they are almost always wrong. So there are very few what you might call strict liability crimes, or there are very few things where the law is automatic. So much of the law turns on your mindset, what's reasonable, what a reasonable person would have done. And this is a situation. I saw somebody, for instance, had posted something on Facebook about how in order for it to be self-defense, half your body has to be inside the house. And since half his body wasn't in the house, it's murder, and he's going to be charged with first-degree murder. And it's like, that is so wrong and obviously stupid. Not to call that person stupid, but that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. And you can sort of imagine why. I mean, imagine someone's charging, you've left your door open because, for a solicitous spring breeze, and all of a sudden you see someone charging towards you with a machine gun and a samurai sword and a bomb strapped around their body, and you pull out a gun, and right as they get to your door, you shoot them. And then the police come and they're like, well, only 1/4 of his body was in your house. If 3/4 had been in your house, you would have been completely justified. But since only his arm and his leg were in when you shot him, that means this is murder, and now you're going to be arrested. I mean, that is just ridiculous. If you're acting reasonably given the circumstances, then you're going to have a right to do something. You don't have to wait until the person is on top of you getting ready to kill you before you can exercise your right to self-defense. Here, obviously, James is trying to get in. And Mitchell, as I've said, has exercised far more restraint than he had to when he finally did open fire on James. And a point that Alice made is so important. If James had been running away and Mitchell had chased him and continued to fire, or if there'd been some break in time where James, he goes and he falls in the driveway and he's obviously no longer a threat. Mitchell goes out there and shoots him while he's on the ground. That would be very different. And that really is the kind of thing the law looks at. When you have this reasonable fear and you act on it, there really needs to be a break in time between that and the later event for us to say that you weren't acting in self-defense. And I think you can understand why that is true. The old legal principle of play stupid games, win stupid prizes is applicable here. This family was living their life, not asking for trouble. James is the one who started this, and once he did that, the consequences of it were kind of on him. And as long as that's occurring, we're not going to split hairs with this innocent family who's defending themselves. If it goes beyond that, if James does break it off, and it looks like this has stopped being self-defense and it started being offensive and it started being vindictive, and the father's like, well, I'm going to show him, and he walks out there and shoots the guy, that would be different. But you don't have anything like that. I think at the end of the day, the law provides for freaking out. If you're an innocent person and you freak out because someone's attacking you, the law is not going to hold you accountable for that. And
And let me put it this way. The facts of this case are pretty compelling, with the voicemail left by James the day before, coming out of the blue after 3 years, that Allison and James had this history that had been abusive, and she had worked very hard to extract herself from this abusive relationship and had heard that James had not gotten better in that interim. This is all helpful, but stand alone, what happened at the time that James showed up at their door is enough to invoke the castle doctrine. Let's say there wasn't this history. Let's say he was a stranger, and he's a stranger who comes to the door, starts ramming and breaking a glass door despite being told, I have a gun or I'm armed, and to get off my property. The castle doctrine says that Mitchell is allowed to shoot him and to defend himself, even without all this back history that we do know about his abusive personality and Allison. And so those facts actually just make this even a more clear case. But know that the castle doctrine actually applies when he shows up at the door, regardless of whether he left a voicemail the day before or had a past relationship with her.
And I think it's very clear here that if Mitchell had not had a firearm, this story would have been ex-boyfriend breaks into home, kills mother and father and ex-girlfriend, and then maybe kills himself. Maybe becomes a murder-suicide. That would have been the story here because he was going in there to kill her. He's a young guy. He was fit. I don't know whether Mitchell could have taken him with his bare hands or not, but that was what he was going in there to do, and there's no question about that. He absolutely was going in there to kill that girl. And Mitchell did what he had to do to defend his family. And Mitchell is a hero in my book. He's not only somebody who exercised his right to self-defense, he's an absolute hero who saved his daughter's life. What his daughter said that was recorded on that 911 call was absolutely true. This could have been a tragedy. I realize it is a tragedy for James's family, but I think everybody involved in this needs to accept the fact that James, for whatever reason, had decided he was going to kill that girl. 3 years after they had broken up, he was coming back to kill her. The first call was to try and lure her out. He wanted to lure her out, and if she had gone out with him, he would have murdered her at that point. But she was smart enough not to do it, so he was crazy enough to actually go to her home to try and carry out the plan that he wanted to execute the day before. And Mitchell was there standing between him, the murderer, and his daughter. And he stopped this from happening. So excellent use of self-defense. Really glad that everybody in Ohio figured that out, that this grand jury knew that, the prosecutors and the police officers knew that. It's a tragic case, but there are times when the only thing that's going to stop evil is force. And that's what Mitchell did.
Yeah, so hopefully this clears up for you what the law of self-defense is. We think that this is a very clear case that we've laid out for you that illustrates it, but we'd love to hear your thoughts. If you have any questions, please write in. You can find us on all the social medias, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and of course our email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com. We love hearing from all of you, and we really thank you guys so much for listening to Legal Briefs and also listening to our other podcast, the Prosecutors Podcast, where we talk about stories in the true crime realm rather than just updates and kind of the law nerdy stuff here on this podcast. But before we close out for the day, Brett, do you have anything else to add?
No, thank you guys so much for continuing to provide all this information. You guys are awesome. It is, like I said, I've said this before, you guys make this podcast easy because you come up with such great topics, and we love covering them for you.
Well, until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Spent like 8 hours at the pool today. I'm so tired. I'm like beyond tired. It's like a special level of tired, you know. Why am I quiet?
Pool wife,
quiet,
yeah.
quiet. Is that better? That's better.
Do like exercises or whatever, like me.
Me, 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 me.
Good job, Alice.
Thank
as
you.
always.
Thank you
were
for
the
taking
best.
double the amount of time to solve my personal problems.
I'll always solve your personal problems, Alice. Anytime. As long as it doesn't get me in trouble.
Well, it might.